When the friendliest resident of San Francisco's SoMa neighborhood suddenly disappears, all of his neighbors are suspicious. Their worst fears are confirmed when a privately hired crime scene cleanup crew arrives at his home, prompting investigators to discover something horrific inside a hidden room in this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
And as always, I'm your co-host, Scott.
This is the revisited and enhanced edition of one of our early episodes, which features the unsolved case of Brian Egg. The original edition was recorded in 2020, and we've revisited and re-recorded an episode on his case in 2025. As I'm sure those of you who've been listening since the early days of Last Seen Alive have noticed, our production and audio quality have improved significantly over the years. Lately, we've been working on remaking our earlier episodes. When we originally recorded them, we were doing the best we knew how at the time. However, our best wasn't the best, and we've learned a lot since then. We want to honor those victims by telling their stories with the production quality they deserve. So, we've been completely remaking all of our early episodes, including this one.
Yeah, this is definitely one of the episodes I've been waiting for because it has long since been in the back of my mind with just how bizarre of a case it is.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of my best friend Whiskey's, his most intriguing cases that he follows because as an officer, he finds it incredible with how bizarre the case really is.
It's a haunting episode. Yeah, this is one I've definitely never really forgotten the details of, even after 5 years, because it is very strange. With that being said, Brian Egg was last seen alive in early June 2018. He was 65 years old at the time and lived in San Francisco's South of Market, or SoMa, neighborhood. He was a fixture in the neighborhood, having lived there for 40 years. In fact, his presence was so ubiquitous in SoMa that it was not seeing him around the neighborhood that was strange and would eventually raise neighbors' suspicions. Brian had first arrived in SoMa in 1976 when he'd purchased and moved into a small single-family home on Clara Street. From inside that house with its white clapboard siding, Brian would watch his neighborhood transform as years and then decades passed by. SoMa began the 1970s as a working-class neighborhood, housing an eclectic mix of blue-collar laborers and other workers like Brian, who worked as a bartender at The Stud, San Francisco's historic and oldest LGBTQ bar. Beginning in the late 1970s, redevelopment efforts sparked a wave of gentrification in SoMa, and the neighborhood began to transform. Brian's home, which he bought for just $19,000 in 1976, last sold in 2019 for over $1.5 million.
To think of prices being that low back then is ridiculous just because the housing market there in particular is incredibly high.
Yeah, it's wild.
Unfortunately, Brian never got to cash in on his investment.
No, he didn't, sadly. Now, I will say, I was going to mention this at the end of the episode, but I'll bring it up now since you mentioned that. His siblings have since sold his property, and they actually used part of the funds to fund nonprofits that Brian, I'm sure, would have approved of. So
that's really endearing that they were able to carry on his memory in a way that he would have appreciated.
Yeah, it certainly didn't go to waste. Anyway, during his residency in SoMa, Brian really did see it all in his neighborhood. Wave after wave of gentrification, the appearance of various big-name company headquarters as the tech boom swept its way across the city, and myriad neighbors who moved in and out of the homes surrounding his over the years. Throughout it all, Brian was happy and comfortable in his home. Like many busy urban areas, SoMa's crime rate left something to be desired, but Brian was an intelligent guy who knew his way around, and he wasn't afraid to get out and enjoy himself. He could frequently be seen in the streets walking his dog and watering the neighborhood plants, which he cared for attentively. On that note, Brian wasn't just a plant guy, he was a people person too. This combination made him a real gem of a neighbor. He was known for gifting potted palm trees to other residents and for making sure that they were always watered. In a modern world where people tend to mind their own business and the sense of community has faded in so many neighborhoods, Brian was a throwback. He said hello to everyone and was considered the friendliest guy in SoMa by a landslide. He was a little eccentric, sure, but he was always kind. Like the potted palm trees suggest, Brian was the kind of person who was always giving gifts, and he even had a habit of inviting friends and acquaintances to stay with him temporarily if they found themselves down on their luck or between residences. So it wasn't uncommon to see temporary guests coming and going from his place every now and then, affirming his reputation as a generous social butterfly. It's abundantly clear that Brian was a real light in his neighborhood. And then, without warning, that light went dark. Neighbors noticed something was off when Brian stopped making appearances outside. One day, he was out walking his dog like he always had, and then people couldn't remember exactly when they'd last seen him walking his dog. For that matter, they couldn't remember when they'd last seen him at all. So they started keeping an eye out for him, but he didn't appear, not to walk his dog and not to water the neighborhood plants, not at all. Brian's family noticed that something was wrong too. They hadn't heard from him in weeks, and again, this wasn't like him. Brian's brother, Devin, who lived out of state, called in an attempt to get in touch, but the phone went to voicemail, inviting Devin to leave a message. This was odd because Brian had never bothered to set up his voicemail in the past. It wasn't something he'd ever used. Normally, if he missed a call while he was out walking his dog or something like that, he'd simply call the person back later to see what they'd wanted. This time, though, there was a recorded greeting inviting Devin to leave a message of his own, and the voice on that recording, the voice claiming that Brian was on vacation and would call back later, was not Brian's. It was a voice that Devin didn't recognize at all. Devin knew that his brother's generosity sometimes resulted in him allowing friends or acquaintances to stay at his place for varying lengths of time, so there was always the chance that a temporary resident of the house had taken the time to set up the long-neglected voicemail. But still, it was odd, especially in combination with the radio silence from Brian himself.
It always stands out as a red flag to me because...
Yeah, absolutely.
It isn't something that had happened in the past when he'd gone on vacation, and if it stands out as odd to a family member, that really should raise the alarm bells in your head anyways.
Yeah, Brian was 65 years old. By that age, people have their habits pretty well established, and his siblings have known him for almost 70 years. So yeah, certainly a red flag.
I really wish we could find out who set up that voicemail message.
I don't know if investigators know for sure, but yes, I'm very curious as well. Now, meanwhile, in SoMa, June gave way to July, and Brian's neighbors began to grow seriously concerned. He'd never taken that long of a vacation before, and there was just no way he'd go so long without making an appearance, not if he was still living in the house anyway. And of course, he was still living in the house, or at least he should have been. What was the alternative? That he'd absconded in the dead of night, abandoning his home of 40 years and telling no one? Vanishing like that was so unimaginable for Brian, who was the polar opposite of a recluse, that the neighbors called police to check on him. He was an active guy and healthy, yes, but he was also 65 years old. What if he'd suffered some sort of medical emergency? And who were those two strange guys who kept coming and going from his house? The neighbors knew that Brian had a habit of having long-term house guests, but he hadn't introduced them to those men, which was unusual. Plus, it seemed as if they'd appeared at about the same time Brian had vanished. In response to the neighbors' requests, police showed up at Brian's house to conduct a welfare check. When they knocked, no one answered. And that was it. That was the check.
That's never enough for a welfare check, ever. Especially if you've got people saying, hey, we haven't seen this person in months and we see them daily.
Yeah, it really only works if the person is 1, fine, and 2, home. If something bad has actually happened to them, it is unhelpful. Now, Brian's neighbors were not satisfied because by that point, they were convinced that something bad had happened to him. And if he had fallen victim to some kind of emergency, knocking on the door wasn't going to help. So they called police again and implored them to find out what was going on. Police did come out again, but it was the exact same deal. They knocked on the door and no one answered, and that was that. This, of course, left the neighbors frustrated. One particularly concerned neighbor was a longtime friend of Brian's, Scott Free. And yes, that's his real name, Scott Free. Scott was so concerned by Brian's disappearance that, according to ABC7, he took to the app next door to discuss it with other neighbors. He quickly learned that they were all on the same page. The whole neighborhood had noticed Brian's absence, and they were worried for him. More neighbors promised to also call the police, hoping that if enough people asked, officers would just, break down and do something other than knock on the door.
I mean, public pressure goes a long way in situations like this. It really does help to motivate people.
Yeah, sometimes being annoying is a very solid strategy, and I think this is one of those times. Now, however, as a result of their efforts, they were unfortunately collectively disappointed for a third time. Police came out again, just like they asked, but again, it was still only to knock on Brian's door. And this did nothing to reassure the neighbors, but it did seem to have an effect upon someone.
The people inside the house, I wonder?
Yes, those two strange guys that the neighbors had noticed going in and out of Brian's home. They seemed to take notice of the police knocking on the door.
The thought arises that had they taken that extra step and actually made entry into the house, if you're one of the two guys just staying there, avoiding the police's attempts to make contact with the homeowner, it's going to look very suspicious and you're going to have to answer a lot of hard questions.
Yeah, it's not a great look. So on that note, the third visit from police did seem to really shake those guys up because after that, they started frantically cleaning. And by frantically cleaning, I mean that neighbors saw soap suds gushing out from beneath the front door of Brian's house, like in a cartoon. Here's how Brian's neighbor, Scott Free, later described it to ABC News. Quote, "I just saw a river of sudsy water pouring out of the front door of Brian's house, and that was very bizarre." End quote. Not only did Scott see the soapy water flowing out of Brian's home, he actually saw one of the men then exit the house and sweep the water down a nearby storm drain. There was just that much of it.
I can only imagine that they had just taken buckets of dish soap and just spread it all over the floor and then gone behind it with a water hose.
That would explain this. So the two strange guys also cleaned the front exterior of the home with bleach before partially repainting it. Scott, I'm sure that by this point, the local next door group was on fire.
It would have to be.
Meanwhile, Brian's family had also grown seriously concerned, enough so that his sister, Lynn, called the police from her home in Florida to file a missing persons report. In response, the police visited Brian's house again, and Scott, can you guess what happened this time?
They knocked on the door?
That is correct. They knocked, no one answered, so they left. Even after all of this, it wasn't until a week later when something so unbelievably outrageous happened that no one, including the police, could possibly ignore it that officers would take the matter seriously.
There have been numerous opportunities that the officers shouldn't have been able to ignore it at this point already.
Yeah, the response here is, let's just say, lackluster. Now, most of our listeners are probably already well aware of the existence of private crime scene cleanup companies. The TV drama CSI introduced them to the public back at the turn of the millennium. For anyone who's never binge-watched CSI and may not be familiar with the concept, crimes, especially homicides and suicides, can be incredibly messy. And when it comes to cleaning up the aftermath, property owners often need professional assistance. So they call a commercial company that specializes in trauma scene decontamination or biohazard remediation, often called crime scene cleanup, when the cause of the mess is a violent criminal act.
Yeah, I'm not sure what most people expect to happen if they are in this situation, but the police don't just magically clean it up for you.
Yeah, police don't have these biohazard remediation teams or anything, so I think most people probably don't think of this unless it happens to them or someone they're close to, but if a violent and messy crime occurs in someone's home or business, it usually takes professional cleaning.
Yeah, in some parts of the country, it can be very difficult to find these companies because if you're out in a rural area, it may not be locally available.
That's true. That is a problem in rural areas. But, in San Francisco, it was no problem to get one of these companies to come to the home. And that was exactly what the strange men who'd been going in and out of Brian's house did. They called a professional crime scene cleanup company. Neighbors realized this when the company's branded van parked outside of Brian's home. And as you can imagine, the arrival of that crew served as a harrowing confirmation of their worst fears. They called 911 right away.
It was bad enough that the sudsy water was spilling out of the front door, but now you've got this on top of that. That means whatever happened, somebody is trying their hardest to clean this out.
Right, and they knew very well that police had not been inside of the home at that point. So when one of these vans shows up, it should only be after police have gone in and seen what's inside. So this time, when police showed up, it was with a much less casual attitude than before. There was no knocking and leaving this time. Instead, they secured a search warrant which allowed them to enter the home, and inside they found a man. That man definitely wasn't Brian. Rather, he was a 52-year-old guy named Robert McCaffrey. He was one of the two strange guys neighbors had noticed coming and going from Brian's house, and it was unclear what right he had, if any, to be inside of Brian's home. Reporting by Julia Jacobo for ABC News does mention, however, that McCaffrey was an acquaintance of Brian's. Police arrested him on scene and found that he had at least $1,000 cash on his person, which he said he intended to use to pay the crime scene cleanup crew.
Yeah, that's another thing about these cleanup crews. They're not free.
No, certainly not. So McCaffrey, his cash, and the cleanup crew weren't the only things investigators found suspicious, though. According to NBC Bay Area, officers also noticed suspicious odors within the home, odors that could easily be detected even over the smell of cleaning chemicals. In light of the highly suspicious circumstances and smells, officers alerted SFPD homicide detectives who took over the investigation and obtained a search warrant for Brian's home the following day. They searched the home thoroughly, even bringing in human remains detection canines, and those canines did alert to the odor of human decay. Still, it wasn't until a couple of days later that they found what they were looking for. It may sound unbelievable that it could take investigators days to locate a body inside of Brian's home, which consisted of only 800 square feet or 74 square meters of space.
Yeah, if I was listening to this for the first time, I would be completely perplexed.
Yeah. Even so, the remains that the canines had detected had been concealed in such an unusual place within the small house that it really did take days for investigators to find them. More on that next. And now, back to Brian's story. When investigators from the San Francisco Police Department's Homicide Division searched the home of missing man Brian Egg, it took them much longer to find what they were looking for than one would imagine. Despite the fact that the home consisted of only 800 square feet or 74 square meters of space, it took investigators 3 days to locate the body concealed within, even with the aid of human remains detection canines. Now, investigators finally made the discovery when they inspected the storage space beneath the stairs. At first, it seemed to contain nothing of consequence, but according to the Bay Area Reporter, there was a door inside that had been entirely concealed behind a picture. So you go into this little room and there's like a door to another little room inside, and this is all beneath the stairs.
Yeah, so I was going to say, I couldn't remember if they had boarded up over the door. I knew they concealed it somehow.
They had hung a picture, a piece of art.
If I was going to do it, I would conceal it behind a fake wall and not leave access to that door at all. But it seems like something that would be so hard to miss.
The people who did this were not geniuses, but it was really well hidden. Who looks in a cupboard below the stairs and sees a picture hanging up and thinks, you know what, I bet there's a door behind that to another little secret room? That's weird.
My only counter to this is that a storage space underneath the stairs is already kind of a weird place to put a picture unless it's like a finished space and a room.
Okay, I agree. I get what you're saying. But on the other hand, maybe they were storing the art. So any way you look at it, a secret door behind a hanging picture is very Scooby-Doo. But it turned out that there was nothing fun or cartoonish behind this little ruse. Behind the hidden door, officers located an aquarium. It was 72 inches long, 28 inches high, and 18 inches wide, plenty of room for a variety of fish to school together. But there were no fish inside the murky liquid it was filled with.
So I was really interested in just how big this aquarium is, because you give dimensions like that, it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around.
Right.
It's large no matter how you look at it, but that's almost 160 gallons. It's 157 gallons or 594 liters. So almost a 600-liter fish tank.
That's enormous. And inside of that enormous aquarium, submerged in a slurry of Drano and water, were partial human remains. When investigators lifted a sawhorse that had been laying over the top of the tank, a torso rose to the surface. Although the decomposition process was well underway, the remains were unmistakably human. Jeans and a t-shirt still clung to them even.
So I'm guessing that they were trying to do some sort of Breaking Bad-esque body decomposition dissolving solution with this Drano.
I do think that was the idea. I think they hoped that it would dissolve the remains and that they could pretend as if they had never existed. But here's the thing. Anyone who has used a liquid drain cleaner like that knows that they can't even dissolve a clump of hair. So, it's not going to work.
It really puts a darker lining around what happened with them trying to scrub out and wash away all of that evidence.
Yeah, they were definitely trying to clean up the evidence of something very dark. So, in addition to the tank and the sawhorse, the little room also contained a detergent, bleach, unspecified odor elimination chemicals, and a small fan that had been pointed at the tank and left running in an attempt to disperse the odors of decomposition and drain cleaner. Two incredibly potent scents that I can only imagine compound each other's awfulness when combined. With this discovery, the investigation had mushroomed from highly suspicious circumstances to an actively unfolding nightmare. The body in the aquarium wasn't whole. The head and hands had been removed in an apparent attempt to conceal the identity of the victim. However, whoever had thought that that would suffice obviously wasn't too bright. Besides the existence of DNA technology, there was also the fact that the body had been hidden inside the home of its owner, who was a known missing and very missed man.
I really think that they thought that nobody would come into the house until the body was too far gone.
Right.
Or that the mixture that they had submerged the body in would make the DNA impossible to recognize, but it's all very low intelligence here.
It is. So, predictably, despite the drain cleaner mixture it had been soaked in, the body was confirmed through DNA testing to be Brian's. His neighbors and family members had been right. Something terrible had happened to him. Now, at this point, investigators who are trained to approach crime scenes with open minds may have wondered, had Brian been murdered, or was there a possibility that his death had been something other than a homicide? For example, had he perhaps died of natural causes or via an accident, only for a sick individual or individuals to attempt to conceal his death in an attempt to use his home or assets for themselves?
It wouldn't be the first time that I've heard of something like that going on.
Right. These sort of stories appear every now and then on the news, stories where people conceal their deceased relatives' remains in freezers, usually not aquariums of drain cleaner, but freezers so that they can take advantage of their assets, often by collecting their pension or social security checks. Things like that do happen, and when they do, the victims are usually older people. But that, according to the medical examiner who conducted Brian's autopsy, was not what had happened in this case. The examiner determined that Brian had died of unspecified homicidal violence with blunt force trauma. At the time of his death, some of his vertebrae and ribs had been freshly broken. Those injuries suggested that he'd been struck forcefully in the chest. Whether he'd also been struck in the head was unknown because by the time of the autopsy, his head and hands still hadn't been recovered, and years later, at the time of this recording, they're still missing. Presumably, Brian's killer or killers removed the head and hands from his remains in an effort to prevent his body from being identified because they thought that the drain cleaner would destroy the DNA. Considering the fact that they left the rest of his remains within his own home, it was, of course, a wasted effort. The only other remains investigators located were some bone fragments in one of Brian's beloved planter boxes in the backyard. Why whoever had dismembered him had buried those small chips in a planter instead of simply leaving them in the aquarium, I have no idea. I also don't know what happened to Brian's dog, unfortunately. I wish I had an update on that to share, but I don't know whether the dog disappeared as well or what.
Since it hasn't been mentioned, I'm assuming that's probably likely.
Right now, I hope that it disappeared and somehow found its way into another loving home, but I cannot confirm that. I choose to believe it, though. Now, in any case, after investigators located Brian's remains, their priorities shifted, of course, to determining who had concealed them in the aquarium. Naturally, Robert McCaffrey, who had been in Brian's house when police had initially arrived to execute their search warrant, was their primary person of interest. Based on the observations of neighbors he'd been spending time at and possibly living in Brian's house ever since his disappearance. On the day investigators had first entered Brian's home and discovered McCaffrey inside, they'd arrested him on the spot on suspicion of homicide and elder abuse. Because that's what happens if you're found in the home of a missing person clenching a fistful of cash you intend to pay a crime scene cleanup crew with.
I mean, yeah.
But McCaffrey wasn't the only person involved. There was also the second strange man who'd been coming and going from Brian's home along with him. Investigators had learned that although McCaffrey had met the cleanup crew at the house with cash, the second guy, a man named Lance Silva, had initially booked the crew and paid the deposit using Brian's debit card.
So that just really goes on to further show that they were continuing to use his house and
his money, yeah. Now, like McCaffrey, Silva was also an acquaintance of some sort of Brian's, according to reporting for ABC News. Police actually discovered this, that Silva had booked the crew with Brian's card an entire day before they even found Brian's body. And of course, they had arrested Silva too, not only on suspicion of homicide and elder abuse, but also on charges of identity theft and financial crimes. Although Silva hadn't been present at the house with his co-conspirator, McCaffrey, police had located him at a nearby hotel, still in possession of Brian's debit card. Silva had a history of prior criminal convictions on charges of embezzlement, grand theft, and identity theft, and was on parole at the time of the arrest. Oh, and one more thing. After arresting Silva, in addition to Brian's debit card, police had discovered documents in Silva's possession from the purchase of a used BMW, along with the key to the car. Further investigation quickly revealed that someone claiming to be Brian Egg had purchased the car at a used car dealership in Newark, California, about 2 months beforehand, back in June.
So that would have been around the time Brian went missing.
Exactly.
All of that makes those identity theft charges really easy to prove.
Yeah, we've got a pretty obvious timeline here. Upon questioning, Silva admitted that he had parked the BMW at a train station about 40 minutes away from San Francisco, and then he rode the train into town. So after learning this, police had the car towed back to San Francisco for investigative purposes. According to reporting for Bay City News, they also visited the dealership and spoke with the owner, who identified Silva as the man who'd purchased the BMW, all the while identifying himself as Brian Egg.
Again, open and close.
Now, how Silva pulled this off, considering that he was only 39 years old and Brian had been 65, I do not know. Now, at this point, you may be wondering how this case is still unsolved. It sounds pretty open and shut, right?
It does.
Well, apparently, prosecutors did not think so. As we discussed, McCaffrey and Silva had both been arrested on August 16th. But here's the thing. The San Francisco District Attorney's Office didn't think there was enough evidence to proceed with the charges investigators had obtained against the men. So they dropped the charges, all of them, despite the crime scene cleaners, despite the BMW, despite everything.
I mean, you at least have the identity theft charges.
Right.
Easy.
That's what I thought. You know, the homicide charges are one thing. There doesn't seem to be, at least as far as public knowledge goes, proof that they actually killed Brian. But the fact that they dropped the identity theft and financial crimes charges against Silva in particular just blows my mind. I mean, when they took him into custody, not only was he in possession of Brian's debit card, he had admitted to using the car, and the dealership owner identified Silva as the person who had purchased the car while pretending to be Brian Egg. Plus, investigators found text messages discussing the sale on Silva's phone. And there's more. Investigators were also able to locate footage of Silva getting into the car and driving off in it.
Not to mention he's already out on parole for similar crimes.
Exactly. The identity theft and financial crimes charges were basically handed to prosecutors on a silver platter that they tossed straight into the garbage.
So one might say they were even handed to them on a silver platter?
Yeah, they might say that. After prosecutors dropped the charges, McCaffrey was released from custody right away. As for Silva, prosecutors in Alameda County, where he'd been sentenced to parole, petitioned to revoke his parole in light of SFPD's suspicions. They were successful, and so it was back to jail for Silva on those old charges.
At least something happened.
It did, but after a year passed, he'd served the remainder of the sentence he'd been on parole for, and there was nothing else Alameda County prosecutors could do. In August of 2019, he was released from custody. At the time of this recording, both he and McCaffrey are, to the best of my knowledge, still free. Also in August of 2019, the San Francisco District Attorney's Office told ABC7 that they would be unable to charge anyone with any crimes against Brian until the police investigation was complete. As for the San Francisco police, they'd also given a statement to ABC7 News saying that the investigation was actively ongoing and promising that they were, quote, following good leads and were confident that they'd make an arrest, end quote.
Okay, that's a lot of confidence for a department that has failed on so many levels.
When we recorded our original episode on this case back in 2020, less than a year had passed since those statements had been made. At the time, I had hoped that the investigation would progress and that charges would be reinstated soon. 5 years later, though, here we are. None of the charges have been reinstated, and disappointingly, I have no updates whatsoever to share with you regarding Brian's case.
Yeah, it really has been disappointing not getting to do an update episode on this case because it feels like a case that should have been a slam dunk.
Yeah, it was a pretty fresh case when we did our original episode on it, but 5 years later, that's not exactly true anymore, and media coverage has been sparse in recent years, and the status of the investigation is unknown to the public. All I can tell you is that, as I mentioned earlier, Brian's siblings sold his home and donated part of the proceeds to a veterans hospital and to the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. In that way, Brian's generosity is continuing to make an impact even after his death. At the time of this recording, his former home, which was taken over by squatters after the sale, is for sale again. The house has been permitted for demolition, and the land it sits on is being marketed as a development opportunity for a multi-unit apartment building. If those plans come to fruition, the space where Brian once lived and was cruelly murdered will be transformed into something new. Which leaves us with several questions. Whether investigators have been able to answer any of them, I don't know. In any case, the public, at the very least, has been left to wonder. Were McCaffrey and or Silva directly responsible for Brian's death? If so, was anyone else complicit? If not, who did murder Brian, and at what point did McCaffrey and Silva decide to exploit his death for their own gain? And of course, where are the rest of Brian's remains?
So one thing that really stands out to me throughout this entire case is the fact that whoever did this did not see any justice yet. And so it really does leave me with the feeling that if I were in that area, at least some people should be feeling uncomfortable and unsafe because somebody is out there that dismembered a body.
And the medical examiner determined that it's definitely a murder we're talking about here. So whoever killed him, whether that's Silva or McCaffrey or both or someone else, they're still out there probably. Now, I'd like to believe that the investigation is actively ongoing, that a solid case is being assembled, and that we'll see charges filed against the appropriate parties soon. Charges that will end in justice for Brian and closure for his family, friends, and neighbors. But of course, I don't know when or whether that will happen. I do know, though, that at the time of his premature and violent death, Brian was enjoying his golden years in the neighborhood where he'd built and lived his life. He'd been a rare example of someone who'd loved his neighbors, and he'd been loved in return. Someone took Brian away from the people and the place he cared about, and they took everything away from Brian. And if that person or persons is still out there, still free, they may very well pose a danger to others. If you know anything about the death of Brian Egg, please call the San Francisco PD's anonymous tip line at 415-575-4444. If you prefer to text rather than call, you can send a text to tip411. Just make sure you begin your message with SFPD so that the right department gets your message. Investigators are especially eager to hear from any business owners or employees who may have been contacted by someone claiming to be Brian Egg or who may have done business with someone alleging to be him. So if that's you, please get in touch.
Yeah, I really hold on to hope that we'll be doing an update episode on this case soon.
And if you found this episode to be of special interest, you may want to check out our episode on the Unsolved Homicide of Hugues de la Plaza. Hugues and Brian's cases are not related, but both cases involve the murder of San Francisco men who were violently killed in their own homes. We aired our episode on Hugues' case in January of 2022. You can scroll back to then in our feed to listen if you'd like.
That's all for this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening. Make sure you check out our website, lastseenalivepodcast.com, for photos from the story and links to the sources we used to write it. While you're at, follow us on Insta at LSA Podcast and TikTok at Last Seen Alive Podcast. Episodes of Last Seen Alive air every Monday. See you then. And if you think bringing unsolved cases like Brian's to the public's attention is important, please take a moment to rate or review Last Seen Alive and tell your friends to check us out too. We really do appreciate it. And don't forget to check out our merch store where you can get an LSA t-shirt or hoodie. We donate 50% of the proceeds from every sale to the DNA Doe Project. Last Seen Alive is a Studio 222 production. Research and writing for this episode is provided by you, Leah. Audio engineering and editing is brought to you by me, Scott.